They won with big promises of change, stability after years of chaos.
Politics can be a force for good. We will show that.
But 100 days in, derailed by riots and freebie rows.
That is how we will govern. Country first, party second.
Keir Starmer's Labour government has only been in power for 100 days, and they have already sparked outrage across the UK. Millions of pensioners who once depended on winter fuel payments to survive the cold have suddenly had that support ripped away, and it wasn't even mentioned in Labour's manifesto. Now, protests are erupting, with angry crowds demanding justice outside Parliament. If Starmer keeps ignoring their voices, could this be the beginning of his downfall?
He warned that his budget would be painful. Today, the Prime Minister defended that pain falling on pensioners. This week, Parliament votes on his plans to stop most pensioners claiming the winter fuel payment.
This is really tough, and I do get that it's tough. It's not easy.
Winter fuel payments have long been a lifeline for millions of pensioners in the UK. These payments, usually given to individuals over a certain age, are designed to help cover the increased energy costs that come with the colder months. For many elderly people, especially those living on fixed incomes, this support can be the difference between staying warm and having to make dangerous sacrifices, like cutting back on food or other essentials to pay the heating bill. In a country like the UK, where winters can be harsh and heating bills skyrocket, the winter fuel payment has been crucial in protecting vulnerable groups from the risk of cold-related illnesses and even death.
They say a week is a long time in politics, so 100 days might feel like an age for Sir Keir Starmer, who has now had the keys to number 10 for that long.
Not this time. Changing a country is not like flicking a switch. The world is now a more volatile place.
However, the Labour government's decision to cut these payments has caused a massive outcry. Labour had campaigned on promises to protect the most vulnerable, yet just 100 days into their governance, they've made a move that seems to contradict those values. What's particularly shocking is that this cut wasn't even mentioned in their election manifesto, leading many to feel misled. It's like they secured votes with one hand and pulled the rug out from under the very people who put their trust in them with the other.
Until now, the winter fuel payment had been a universal benefit that even wealthy pensioners were eligible for. The tax-free yearly payment is £300 for those over 80 and £200 for younger recipients in England and Wales.
Naturally, the public reaction has been fierce. Pensioners, who are already grappling with the rising cost of living, feel abandoned. The suddenness of this decision has left them scrambling, trying to figure out how they will make ends meet during the upcoming winter. Vulnerable groups, including pensioners and low-income families, are particularly outraged because they expected Labour to be their ally, not the party that would take away critical support. For these groups, the decision feels like a betrayal, leaving them feeling neglected and unheard. The outcry isn't just about the money, it's about trust, security, and the fear of facing a brutal winter without help. It's no wonder that this issue has sparked such intense reactions across the country.
The Prime Minister faces a rebellion from Labour MPs in Parliament this week. Why are you prepared to rebel when we know that wealthy pensioners are eligible for this payment? We know that this is going to be means tested, which means the most vulnerable will still be eligible.
The decision to cut winter fuel payments hasn't just ignited outrage among the public, it has also led to serious backlash within Parliament. Many MPs, including members of Labour's party, have expressed their disapproval, leading to a growing sense of discontent within Starmer's ranks. While Labour's leadership might have hoped to downplay the controversy, the reality is that opposition to the decision has only gained momentum. Even within Labour, MPs are questioning the wisdom of cutting support for pensioners at such a critical time. Politicians from across the spectrum have criticised the move, and the voices are growing louder by the day. Some have even pointed out the irony. Britain is one of the wealthiest economies in the world, yet the government is choosing to pinch pennies by cutting a relatively small but vital payment for some of its most vulnerable citizens. Sharon Graham, General Secretary of the Unite Union, has been particularly vocal. She has called the decision completely wrong and vowed that this protest movement is just the beginning of what could become a significant challenge for Starmer's leadership. With Unite backing the movement, the Labour Party risks alienating not only pensioners, but also key allies within the trade union movement.
Now, after 14 years in the political wilderness, Labour is back, with Sir Keir Starmer about to move into 10 Downing Street.
We have one job, which is to make this a summer of change.
I think we'll expect a fairly pragmatic approach.
What has made matters worse is Keir Starmer's apparent refusal to address the criticism head-on. His silence on the issue has only added fuel to the fire, leaving many wondering if he's intentionally avoiding the subject or simply dismissing the concerns as unimportant. This has further inflamed tensions, particularly among those who expected Labour to stand by its promises. The longer Starmer remains silent, the more it feels like he's turning his back on the very people Labour promised to protect. His inability or unwillingness to publicly address the issue is making it harder for those within the party to defend the decision, leading to growing frustration from all sides.
We know there's about 1 million pensioners above the pension credit threshold who are in fuel poverty, and taking away the winter fuel payment will mean that those people have that tough choice between heating and eating or indeed going cold, and that's why we need to protect the vulnerable.
The decision to cut winter fuel payments has sparked a wave of protests that show no signs of slowing down. What began as frustration within small circles quickly snowballed into large-scale demonstrations, with pensioners leading the charge. Hundreds of angry citizens recently gathered outside Parliament, chanting slogans like, "Keir Starmer, don't be cruel, give us back our winter fuel." The sight of so many elderly people, many of whom are dependent on these payments to survive the harsh winters, protesting in front of Parliament painted a clear picture. This issue is about much more than just politics. It's about survival and dignity. The National Pensioners Convention, NPC, and Unite Union were the driving forces behind the protest, organising the event to give voice to the pensioners who felt abandoned by a government they believed would protect them. The NPC has long been an advocate for the rights and well-being of older people, and this cut to winter fuel payments struck a particularly sensitive chord. For these pensioners, this was the ultimate betrayal, especially from a Labour government they thought would stand by their side. Unite Union, one of the country's largest and most influential trade unions, was quick to back the movement. With their considerable resources and influence, the protest gained momentum fast. The union's General Secretary, Sharon Graham, emphasised that this was just the beginning of a much larger campaign, warning the Labour leadership that the protests would only intensify if their demands were ignored. Graham's involvement brings considerable weight to the protest. As the head of a union with hundreds of thousands of members, including 100,000 pensioners, she can escalate the protests to a national level if Starmer's government refuses to reverse the decision. One of the most striking developments in this protest movement has been the unexpected alliances that have formed in opposition to Labour's decision. Several major charities and union groups, many of which have traditionally supported Labour, have joined forces with pensioners to express their outrage. It's not just about cutting payments to pensioners, it's about the principle of how one of the wealthiest nations in the world is choosing to treat its elderly citizens. Sharon Graham, the outspoken leader of Unite Union, hasn't minced words when it comes to Labour's decision. In one of her speeches, she stated bluntly that the UK is the 6th wealthiest economy in the world, yet they are taking money from pensioners, which is completely wrong. Unite Union's decision to back the protests is a significant move. As one of the largest trade unions in the country, their support gives the movement serious muscle. Unions have historically been among Labour's biggest supporters, so when Unite comes out in strong opposition to a Labour policy, it sends a clear message. For Sharon Graham, this isn't just about a single issue. This is about holding the government accountable to the promises it made during the election. With Unite's backing, the protests are poised to become an even larger political headache for Keir Starmer, especially as more union members and their families join the cause.
But this winter, that number is estimated to fall to just 1.5 million. The estimated saving to the public purse is £1.4 billion, a fraction of the £22 billion gap in the budget that the government says it needs to close.
Several charities have also stepped up to criticise the cuts, underscoring how vital winter fuel payments are for pensioners who are already struggling with the rising cost of living. These organisations, which work directly with vulnerable groups, have been vocal in condemning Labour's decision. They argue that the cuts put pensioners' lives at risk, particularly those who are already on the brink of poverty. For many elderly people, the winter fuel payment is what allows them to keep their homes warm during the coldest months. Taking that away means forcing them to choose between heating and other essentials, which is not a choice anyone should have to make in a country as wealthy as the UK.
Karen Graham, this weekend you've accused the Labour leadership of miserable managerialism. Is there anything that Keir Starmer could say or do that would convince you that a Starmer-led government won't just be warmed over Blairism?
Sharon Graham's declaration that this protest is just the beginning sent a strong message to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. As the General Secretary of Unite, one of the most influential unions in the UK, Graham holds considerable power, and her warning wasn't just empty rhetoric. She made it clear that the protest outside Parliament was only the first step in what could become a much larger and more disruptive movement if the government doesn't reverse its decision to cut winter fuel payments. With 100,000 pensioner members in the United and millions of future pensioners who will eventually rely on similar support, Graham has the numbers and the backing to escalate this into a nationwide movement that Starmer won't be able to ignore.
Because my job is to fight for workers. That's the job that I have. I'm here for some of this week because we're at the business end now. We're at the business end. We're affiliated to Labour and we're at the business end. And I want to say really clearly, they need to put a better offer on the table for workers. Now, I think, obviously, I hope they win. I want them to win. But there's a difference between limping into number 10 and being actually carried in there to say, look, actually, this person's going to come in and they're going to back for us.
What makes Graham's vow particularly significant is the sheer size and influence of the Unite Union. When she says that more protests are coming, she's talking about mobilising one of the most powerful groups in the country. Unite has the resources and the organisational strength to coordinate protests across the UK, potentially turning a single event into a national campaign that could seriously disrupt the government. Imagine mass protests in every major city, blocking roads, creating pressure on local MPs, and forcing the media to cover the issue more intensely. It wouldn't take much for these demonstrations to snowball into something that creates real political consequences for Labour. Beyond just protests, Graham hinted at a broader strategy that could involve strikes and other forms of industrial action. With millions of members, Unite can grind key sectors of the economy to a halt if they feel the need to escalate. And it's not just pensioners who are upset. Many workers who are currently part of Unite will one day be pensioners themselves. So this issue hits home for them too. By framing the cuts as an attack on the future well-being of every working person, Graham can rally broader support within the union. Her strategy is clear. Keep the pressure on until Labour is forced to reverse its decision. The longer Starmer waits, the more intense this movement will become, and if he continues to ignore the outcry, he risks facing not just protests, but a full-blown political crisis.
She said, her words, I have people in my constituency telling me they don't need winter fuel payments. Why do we not have a more sophisticated mechanism for mean testing? That's their favourite, I think, in the contest that they are having.
Labour's decision to cut winter fuel payments has been seen as a major betrayal by many voters, particularly because this move was never mentioned in their election manifesto. When Labour campaigned to take office, they promised to protect the most vulnerable in society, pensioners included. For many, this promise was a key reason they voted for Labour in the first place. Cutting winter fuel payments, which help millions of elderly people survive the colder months, flies directly in the face of that pledge. The feeling of betrayal is palpable. People didn't just feel like Labour failed to deliver, they felt misled. It's one thing to make a tough political decision, but it's another to make that decision without ever signalling it was on the table during the campaign. This broken promise is already having a huge impact on Labour's credibility. The trust voters placed in the party is fragile, and by making cuts that target some of the most vulnerable people in the country, Labour has damaged that trust. Many pensioners and working class voters are now questioning whether Labour is truly the party that will look out for their interests. And it's not just the pensioners who are angry. Many others who supported Labour feel that if the party can break a promise like this, what's stopping them from backtracking on other key issues? People vote based on the promises they're given, and when those promises are broken, it undermines the very foundation of democracy.